Caleb Morgan placed his employee badge on the conference table and stood up. After 9 years with the company, he had just been fired for refusing to put an innocent man's name on a report he knew was false. 20 minutes later, a major customer walked into an executive meeting, looked around the room, and asked one question: "Where's Caleb Morgan?" Dana Whitmore stopped breathing for a second, because she had just sent him home. Caleb Morgan stared at the plastic employee badge lying between him and Dana Whitmore. For 9 years, that badge had opened every door in the building. Now the woman across from him was asking him to hand over the keys that went with it. "Effective immediately," Dana said, folding her hands on the conference table. "Your employment with Whitmore Distribution is terminated." The HR representative beside her kept her eyes on a folder. Caleb did not. He looked directly at Dana. "Does the report say I refuse to sign it?" Dana's expression barely changed. "It says you refused a reasonable instruction from management." Caleb waited a second. Then he turned toward HR. "I'd like the record to show those are not the same thing." No one answered. Caleb slowly removed the badge from the lanyard around his neck and placed it on the table. At 4:47 that afternoon, he walked out of the building carrying nothing but his coat, his lunch bag, and a small cardboard box someone from reception had found for the few personal things he kept at his desk. He did not know that 23 minutes later, one floor above the room where he had just been dismissed, a man worth more to the company than any executive in the building would ask a question no one was prepared to answer. "Before we discuss the new distribution agreement," Thomas Harrison said, looking around the conference table, "where's Caleb Morgan?" Dana stopped turning a page. The president of Whitmore Distribution looked toward her. "Caleb Morgan?" Thomas nodded. "The operations coordinator. I was told he worked out of this office." Dana's fingers tightened slightly around her pen. "He did." Thomas looked at her. "Did?" No one in that room yet understood why the founder of Harrison Home Supply had traveled nearly 400 miles and remembered the name of an employee who had never held an executive title. But Dana understood one thing immediately. This meeting had just become much more complicated, and Caleb Morgan had no idea. 3 hours earlier, Caleb had been standing in the break room pouring the last half cup of coffee from a pot no one else wanted. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. "Ruby, school office." He answered immediately. "Hey, kiddo, everything okay?" His 11-year-old daughter lowered her voice as though she were calling from somewhere she was not supposed to be. "Yeah, Mrs. Bennett said I could call because rehearsal changed." Caleb checked the wall clock. "Changed how?" "They moved pickup to 5:15. He smiled. "That's all?" "I thought you needed to know." "I do." There was a pause. Then Ruby asked, "Are you going to get in trouble again?" Caleb's smile disappeared. "Why would you ask that?" "Because last time you said your boss was upset when you left." Caleb looked through the glass wall toward the open office. Dana was standing beside a row of desks, speaking with 2 supervisors. "Your dad can handle his boss." "That's not what I asked." For a moment, Caleb said nothing. Ruby had inherited that from her mother, the uncomfortable talent of hearing the answer hidden inside someone else's silence. "I'll be there at 5:15, he said. "Promise?" "Promise." The school secretary called Ruby's name in the background. "Okay. Love you. Love you too." Caleb ended the call. When he turned around, Dana was standing in the doorway. "How long will you need to be gone tonight?" Caleb already knew what the question meant. Not, "What time are you leaving?" Not, "Is Ruby okay?" How long would the company have to survive without him physically sitting at his desk? "I'm leaving at 5, Caleb said. "I'll log back in after dinner." Dana glanced at the clock. "We have Harrison tomorrow morning." "I know. And there are still unresolved shipment entries. I've cleared 19 of the 21. That leaves 2. I'll finish them tonight." Dana stepped farther into the room. "From home?" "Yes." She sighed quietly. Not enough to sound angry, just enough to make him feel as though he had disappointed her again. "Caleb, I understand you have responsibilities outside this building. He waited. Dana continued. But everyone here has a life outside this building. There it was. The sentence she always used when she wanted to make his daughter sound like a scheduling problem. Caleb put the coffee cup down. The work will be finished. That isn't always the point. What is the point? Dana looked at him for a moment. Availability. Caleb almost laughed, but he knew she was serious. For months, that word had appeared in every conversation about promotions, leadership assignments, and performance reviews. Availability. Not accuracy. Not client retention. Not the number of problems solved. Availability. Caleb nodded once. Then I guess we measure commitment differently. Dana's face hardened. Before she could respond, a junior coordinator appeared at the door holding a printed report. Caleb, sorry, you need to see this. He took the pages. The first sheet contained the shipment discrepancy that had kept half the operations team working since morning. Caleb read the explanation once, then again. His eyes stopped on one sentence. Warehouse processing error. Employee failure to follow loading protocol. That's not what happened, he said. The coordinator lowered her voice. I know. Caleb looked toward Dana. She was already watching him. And from the expression on her face, he knew something else. She knew it too. That was the moment Caleb realized the argument about leaving at 5 was no longer the biggest problem he had that day. Caleb read the line on the report a third time. Warehouse processing error. Employee failure to follow loading protocol. The employee named underneath it was Marcus Reed, a 58-year-old warehouse lead, who had been with Whitmore Distribution longer than Caleb had. Caleb knew Marcus. More importantly, he knew what had happened that morning. The loading sheet was changed after Marcus signed it, Caleb said. The junior coordinator, Natalie Price, glanced toward the hallway before answering. That's what the system shows. Then why does this blame him? Natalie swallowed. I was told to use the explanation operations approved. Caleb looked at Dana. She was no longer standing in the break room doorway. She had already returned to the main floor. Who approved it? Natalie did not answer. She did not need to. Caleb folded the report once and carried it back to his desk. At 2:06 p.m., Dana sent him a meeting invitation. Subject, Harrison Account Review, Final Documentation. Time, 4 p.m. No explanation. Caleb stared at the message for a moment, then opened the shipment logs. The problem was straightforward. A regional planner had changed the loading sequence after Marcus's team had completed the original order. The warehouse had followed the instructions it had been given. By the time someone discovered the change, 2 truckloads were already moving toward the wrong distribution center. It was an expensive mistake. It was also not Marcus's. Caleb opened the audit trail. There it was. Timestamps. User IDs. Every change recorded automatically. He saved a copy to the account folder. Then his eyes drifted toward the clock. 2:14. 3 hours until Ruby needed him. He told himself that should be more than enough time. But Dana had a talent for turning 10-minute conversations into decisions that followed you for months. At 3:02, Marcus called from the warehouse. Caleb, you got a minute? I've got one. That report going around. Caleb leaned back. What about it? They're saying I changed the load. I saw. Marcus was silent for a few seconds. I didn't. I know. The answer came so quickly that Marcus stopped talking. Then he said, You checked? Yes. Another silence. This one felt different. Relief. I've been here 22 years, Marcus finally said. Never had a write-up for a shipment error. You still don't. You sure about that? Caleb looked toward Dana's office. No, he admitted. But the system is. Marcus let out a humorless laugh. That's supposed to make me feel better? It should. Why? Because systems keep records longer than people keep stories straight. For the first time, Marcus laughed for real. Your wife used to say things like that? Caleb froze for half a second. Marcus immediately regretted it. Sorry, I shouldn't have. It's okay. Caleb looked at the photograph beside his monitor. Not the kind of family portrait people posed for at a studio. Just a picture Ruby had taken 3 summers ago. Caleb and his wife Anna, sitting on the back steps with paper plates in their laps, while Ruby leaned into the frame and cut off half Caleb's head. Anna had been laughing. That was why he kept it. She usually said them better, Caleb replied. Marcus softened. You picking Ruby up today? 5:15. Then don't let this place make you late. Caleb smiled slightly. I'll do my best. No, don't do your best. Leave. Caleb ended the call. For a few seconds, he simply sat there. There were people in that building who understood him perfectly. Dana just happened to be the person writing his reviews. At 4 o'clock, Caleb entered the small conference room. Dana was already there. A printed copy of the shipment report sat in front of her. No HR representative. No Natalie. Just Dana. Close the door, she said. Caleb did. Dana pushed the report toward him. I need your sign-off before the Harrison file is finalized. Caleb remained standing. I can't sign this. Dana looked up. You haven't even sat down. I read it. And? It blames Marcus Reed for something the audit trail shows happened after his team finished the load. Dana leaned back. The report reflects operational responsibility. No, it names him. Marcus was warehouse lead. That doesn't make him responsible for a change made by planning. Dana's voice became quieter. Caleb, tomorrow's review is not the time to reopen internal blame. There it was again. Not the truth. The timing. What happens to Marcus if I sign this? He'll have a performance conversation. For something he didn't do. For a failure that occurred under his area. Caleb pulled out the chair but did not sit. You know that isn't the same thing. Dana's jaw tightened. You have a habit of turning routine decisions into moral questions. Caleb considered that. Sometimes they are. Dana looked at the clock. 4:07. Then back at him. This is exactly what I mean when I talk about leadership readiness. Caleb almost smiled. What does Marcus have to do with my leadership review? You're missing the larger picture. Then explain it. Dana folded her hands. We are entering the most important vendor review this region has had in years. Harrison is considering a much broader distribution agreement. Senior leadership is watching this department closely. I know. And instead of helping me close an issue, you're arguing over one line in an internal report. One line with someone's name on it. Dana stared at him. Do you think Marcus would risk this entire account for you? Caleb answered immediately. That's not how I decide what's true. For the first time, Dana looked genuinely frustrated. You always do this. Do what? Act like there's no cost to being principled. Caleb did not answer. Because that part, at least, was true. There was always a cost. He knew that better than she realized. 3 years earlier, after Anna died, Caleb had learned that every promise carried a price. If he promised Ruby he would be at school pickup, then something else had to wait. If he promised a client he would finish a report, then sometimes he worked after midnight. If he promised himself he would keep the house steady, then grief often waited until the dishwasher was running and Ruby was asleep. Nothing disappeared because he chose one responsibility. It simply moved later. That was what Dana never seemed to understand about 5 o'clock. Caleb did not stop working at 5. He changed jobs. At 5:15, he became the person waiting outside a school. At 5:30, he became the person asking about homework. At 6, the person burning onions, because Ruby always distracted him with stories while he cooked. At 7:30, the person checking a math worksheet. And around 9:15, when Ruby finally went to bed, he opened the same laptop Dana imagined he had abandoned and became her operations coordinator again. The difference was that no one applauded the second shift. Caleb did not expect them to. He only wanted them to stop pretending it did not exist. Dana slid the report closer. Sign it, Caleb. He looked down at the signature line. I can sign a corrected version. We don't have time to rewrite the entire incident report. One sentence. The report is approved. Then it doesn't need my signature. Dana's eyes narrowed. That's your final answer? Yes. Dana slowly pulled the document back toward herself. All right. She placed it inside a folder. The simplicity of the gesture made Caleb more uneasy than shouting would have. That's it? He asked. For now. Caleb checked the clock. 4:21. He still had time to finish the 2 remaining shipment entries before leaving. As he reached the door, Dana spoke again. Caleb. He turned. Tomorrow morning's Harrison review was moved forward. Thomas Harrison arrived in Columbus early. Senior leadership is meeting with him late this afternoon before the formal session tomorrow. That explained the unusual activity upstairs. Caleb nodded. Okay. I need the entire department available. Caleb knew exactly where the conversation was going. What time? Until the meeting is finished. I have to leave at 5. Dana stared at him. Of course you do. I can join remotely after I pick Ruby up. This is not a remote meeting. I'm not scheduled to present. That isn't the point. Caleb heard her own word coming back. Availability. I promised my daughter. Dana's expression became almost sympathetic. That somehow made it worse. You keep making choices, Caleb. You can't be surprised when the company notices them. He stood motionless. Then he nodded once. I suppose not. At 4:32, Caleb returned to his desk. Natalie rolled her chair closer. What happened? He wants Marcus's name left on the report? She whispered. She. Dana. Sorry. Caleb gave a small smile. Yes. Are you going to sign it? No. Natalie looked genuinely frightened for him. Caleb, it isn't true. I know, but Dana's been documenting everything. He stopped. What everything? Natalie immediately wished she had not said it. What do you mean? She lowered her voice. The late meetings you don't attend, the days you leave at 5, when you ask to join the quarterly review by video because Ruby had that school thing. Caleb stared at her. How do you know? I helped assemble the manager files last week. The office noise seemed to fall away. Manager files for what? Natalie shook her head. I don't know. Performance planning, maybe. But Caleb saw it in her face. She knew more than she wanted to say. He looked toward Dana's office. The blinds were closed. For months, Caleb had assumed her remarks about availability were irritation, perhaps even disappointment. He had never considered that she was building a record. His phone buzzed. A text from Ruby. Don't forget 5:15. Caleb read it twice. Then he typed, wouldn't dare. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. At 4:38, another message appeared on his computer. From Dana. Please come to conference room C. HR will join us. Caleb looked at Natalie. She had seen the notification reflected on his screen. Neither of them spoke. Caleb closed the Harrison account file. He stood, and before walking away from his desk, he did one thing Dana would not learn about until much later. He forwarded the shipment audit trail into the official incident record. Not to himself, not to a private account, not as insurance. He put it where it belonged, inside the company's own file. The truth did not need to leave the building with him. It only needed to remain somewhere no one could quietly rewrite it. 26 minutes later, Caleb no longer worked for Whitmore Distribution. At 5:12, he pulled into the school parking lot. Ruby came through the side doors 3 minutes later, carrying her backpack and a rolled-up rehearsal poster. She opened the passenger door. You made it. Caleb looked at the dashboard clock. 5:15 exactly. Told you I would. Ruby climbed in. Then she noticed something. She stared at his chest. Dad? Yeah? Where's your work badge? Caleb's hands tightened around the steering wheel. For the first time all afternoon, he had no prepared answer. And somewhere across town, Thomas Harrison had just asked the question that might change what happened next. Not because Caleb Morgan was the most powerful employee at Whitmore Distribution, but because, months earlier, When nobody important was watching, Caleb had told Thomas Harrison a truth that could have cost his own company money. And Thomas had never forgotten it. Ruby was still looking at Caleb's chest. The empty place where his work badge usually hung seemed much larger than it should have. "What, Dad?" Caleb started the car. "It's complicated." Ruby pulled the door shut. "That means something bad happened. It means I don't want to explain it in a school parking lot." She studied him for a second, then looked out the window. Caleb hated that expression. Not fear exactly. Calculation. Ruby had learned, after losing her mother, that adults sometimes softened bad news before delivering it. She had become too good at recognizing the pause before a difficult sentence. Caleb drove 3 blocks before she spoke again. "Did you get fired?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Yes." Ruby did not say anything. The traffic light ahead turned red. Caleb stopped. Then she asked the question he had been dreading. "Because of me?" His head turned so quickly she flinched. "No. But you left early because of me. I left when I was supposed to leave. And your boss didn't like it. That wasn't why this happened." Ruby frowned. "Then why?" Caleb exhaled slowly. "Someone made a mistake at work. My manager wanted me to approve a report that blamed somebody else. Did they do it?" "No." "So you didn't sign?" "No." Ruby thought about that. Then she gave a tiny shrug. "Then why are you acting like you did something wrong?" Caleb stared at her. Children could make a complicated life sound embarrassingly simple. He looked back at the road. "I'm not." "You kind of are." The light turned green. Caleb drove. After another block, Ruby said, "Are we going to lose the house?" The question landed harder than anything Dana had said all day. "No." He answered too quickly. Ruby noticed. Caleb corrected himself. "We're going to be careful for a while, but I have savings. I'll find another job." "You promise?" Caleb hesitated. There were promises a father made because he controlled the outcome. Pickup times. Dinner. Showing up. And there were promises that depended on things no one controlled. He had learned not to confuse the two. "I promise I'll do everything I can," he said. Ruby nodded. That answer seemed to satisfy her more than a lie would have. Then she unrolled the rehearsal poster across her knees. "You want to see the terrible sign I made?" Caleb smiled. "Yes." And for the rest of the drive home, Ruby talked about the school play. Caleb listened. He asked questions. He laughed at the right places. Only once did his eyes drift toward the rearview mirror, where the Whitmore distribution building disappeared behind them. At the same time, Dana Whitmore was sitting in a conference room with 5 senior leaders and one increasingly confused customer. Thomas Harrison leaned forward. "I'm sorry. Maybe I misunderstood." No one moved. "You said Caleb no longer works here." Dana kept her voice professional. "His employment ended this afternoon." Thomas looked at the president of Whitmore Distribution, Arthur Bell. "Was he transferred?" "No," Arthur said carefully. "Then what does ended mean?" Dana answered. "He was terminated." Thomas sat back. For several seconds he said nothing. Arthur glanced toward Dana. "Thomas, this is an internal personnel matter. I'm sure we can—" "No." Thomas's voice was not loud, but it stopped the room. "I'm not asking for private details. I'm asking whether the man I specifically requested for this account was fired hours before I arrived." Dana's jaw tightened. "You requested him?" Thomas looked at her. 3 weeks ago." Dana turned toward Arthur. Arthur looked toward the vice president of sales. The vice president opened a folder. "I believe the request came through the account notes." Dana's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Thomas noticed. "So no one told you?" Dana recovered quickly. "We have hundreds of account notes. Do you have hundreds naming one employee?" No answer. Thomas folded his hands. "Let me explain why I asked." Arthur nodded. Thomas looked around the table. 8 months ago, one of our stores in Dayton was preparing for a holiday weekend. We had a shipment due Friday morning. Refrigerators, ranges, washers, the kind of inventory that pays payroll when you sell it. Dana knew the incident. She remembered it as a shipping adjustment. Thomas remembered it differently. The truck didn't come. He paused. Our store manager called your service line. He was told the carrier had missed pickup. Arthur nodded politely. Thomas continued. That wasn't true. Dana shifted in her chair. Thomas looked directly at her. Caleb Morgan called me 20 minutes later and told me the error was here. Nobody spoke. He didn't say a system issue. He didn't say a third-party delay. He said, Mr. Harrison, we released the wrong load sequence. This is ours. Arthur glanced at his vice president. Thomas continued. I was angry, very angry. I asked him what he planned to do about it. A faint smile crossed Thomas's face. He said, fix it before I explain it. For the first time since Caleb's name had been mentioned, Arthur looked interested rather than merely concerned. Thomas leaned back. By 6 that evening, he had replacement stock moving out of 2 different warehouses. Dana spoke. Our operations team handled that recovery. Thomas turned toward her. I'm sure they did. His tone remained polite. But Caleb was the person calling me every hour. Dana said nothing. He stayed on the problem until nearly 11. That sentence landed differently. Arthur looked at Dana. Dana's face remained still. Thomas continued. At one point I asked him why he sounded like he was whispering. A small laugh moved through the table. Thomas did not laugh. He told me his daughter was asleep in the next room. Arthur stopped smiling. Thomas looked around. He had gone home. He had gone home, picked up his child, fed her, put her to bed, then kept working. Dana's pen stopped moving. He never told me that because he wanted credit, Thomas said. I found out because I heard a child ask for water in the background. No one interrupted him. The next Monday I called your office to compliment him. Caleb told me not to make a fuss. Thomas shook his head. He said the warehouse team had done the hard part. A senior executive asked, and that's why you requested him for the expansion account. That's part of it. What's the other part? Thomas looked toward the documents in front of him. When companies are trying to win your business, everyone is honest. He tapped one page. What matters is whether they're honest after something goes wrong. That sentence settled over the room. Then Thomas added, I don't need Caleb because he knows our account better than anyone. I need to know the company I'm expanding with has people who behave like that. Lana crossed her arms. With respect, one positive customer interaction does not override an employee's broader performance record. Arthur looked at her. What broader performance record? Dana answered carefully. Caleb has had recurring availability issues. Thomas frowned. Availability? He frequently leaves at 5. He has declined after-hours meetings and has limited flexibility for leadership assignments. Thomas stared at her. You just heard me tell you the man worked until 11. From home. Thomas said nothing. Dana realized how that sounded only after she had said it. Arthur slowly turned toward HR Director Melissa Grant, who had been invited to the meeting because of the morning's personnel action. Melissa. Yes? Was Caleb's remote work part of his performance review? Melissa opened the employee file on her tablet. I'd have to verify the full record. Do that. Dana leaned forward. Arthur, we have a client meeting scheduled. Thomas shook his head. No. Dana looked at him. Thomas pointed toward the untouched agreement. You have a people problem before you have a client meeting. At home, Caleb made grilled cheese sandwiches. Ruby sat at the kitchen table with her homework. Caleb had opened his laptop but had not touched it. The screen showed an empty search bar. He had typed, Operations Coordinator Jobs Columbus, then deleted it. Then typed, Client Service Manager Logistics, deleted that too. Ruby looked up. You're staring. At what? The computer. That's usually how computers work. You're not doing anything. Caleb closed the lid. I'm thinking. About getting another job? Yes. Can't you just get your old one back? Caleb smiled faintly. I don't think it works like returning shoes. Ruby considered that. Do you want it back? That question stopped him. Did he? For 9 years, Whitmore Distribution had been stable. The insurance had been good. The commute was manageable. He knew the systems. He knew the customers. Marcus had attended Anna's funeral. Natalie had once spent her lunch break helping Ruby build a ridiculous cardboard volcano for school. There were people there Caleb cared about. But every time he thought about going back, he heard Dana's voice. You keep making choices, Caleb. As if being Ruby's father were an inconvenient preference. I don't know, he said. Ruby nodded. Then she returned to her homework. 5 minutes later she said, if they ask you back, make them say sorry. Caleb looked at her. She kept writing. Ruby. What? You can't negotiate my career from your math worksheet. I'm just saying. Caleb laughed. It was the first real laugh he had managed since Conference Room C. His phone rang. The screen showed Natalie Price. He almost answered, then stopped. If she was calling from work about an internal issue, he was no longer supposed to be part of it. He let it ring. A message appeared moments later. Please call me. You need to know what's happening. Caleb stared at it. Ruby looked up. Work? Maybe. You should answer. Why? Because you're staring again. Caleb stepped into the hallway and called Natalie. She answered on the first ring. Caleb? I'm here. Thomas Harrison is upstairs. I know. Dana mentioned he came early. No. Caleb? He asked for you. Caleb leaned against the wall. What? He asked where you were before they started the meeting. Caleb said nothing. Natalie continued. Dana told him you were terminated. A cold feeling moved through his chest. Not hope. Not yet. What happened? Everything stopped. Natalie, what does that mean? It means no one is talking about the presentation anymore. Caleb lowered his voice. Why did Harrison ask for me? I don't know. Something about Dayton. Caleb closed his eyes. The shipment. 8 months ago. He remembered the night immediately. Ruby asleep on the couch while he called 2 warehouses. A pan of pasta gone cold. Thomas Harrison shouting into the phone at first, then calming down once Caleb stopped giving him excuses. It had been a difficult night, but not a heroic one. He had simply fixed a problem. Natalie, listen to me. What? Do not get yourself involved. I already am. No, you're not. I told HR about Dana's files. Caleb straightened. What files? The performance records. Natalie. She had me organize them last week. There were notes about every time you left before a late meeting. Caleb rubbed his forehead. I don't want you risking your job. She was going to use today's shipment report against you. She did. I know. Natalie's voice dropped. HR asked for the incident history. Caleb went silent. The Marcus report? He asked. Yes. Did they see the audit trail? I don't know. Caleb thought about the document he had attached before leaving. I put it in the official file. Natalie exhaled. Of course you did. What does that mean? It means you got fired and still made sure the evidence stayed where the company could find it. Caleb did not know how to answer. Natalie continued. Melissa Grant is reviewing everything now. Then let her. You don't want to know what happens? Yes. He looked toward the kitchen. Ruby was pretending not to listen. But I'm not calling anyone there. Why? Because if the truth only matters when I'm standing in the room defending myself, then it isn't much of a truth. Natalie was quiet. Finally, she said, I'll call you if there's something you actually need to know. Thank you. And Caleb? Yeah? Marcus knows. Caleb frowned. Knows what? That you refused to sign the report. He closed his eyes briefly. How? HR interviewed him. What did he say? Natalie laughed softly. You know Marcus. Caleb could already imagine it. What did he say? He said if the company wanted to fire the man who protected his record after 22 years of service, maybe they should start by explaining why. Caleb almost smiled. That sounds like him. It does. They ended the call. Caleb returned to the kitchen. Ruby looked up immediately. So? So what? Are they sorry? Ruby, that means no. They're reviewing what happened. What does reviewing mean? It means adults sometimes need several meetings to discover what was obvious the first time. Ruby nodded seriously. That sounds inefficient. Caleb stared at her. Please never become a consultant. Back at Whitmore, the review was becoming worse for Dana. Melissa Grant had pulled Caleb's access logs. The numbers were not flattering. Not for Caleb, for the narrative written about him. During the previous 6 months, Caleb had logged into company systems from home on 47 evenings. On 14 of those nights, he had worked past 9:30. His total completed client cases ranked second in the regional office. His error rate was among the lowest. Arthur Bell stared at the report. So when his review says, limited availability after normal hours, Melissa answered carefully. It appears to refer primarily to his physical availability in the office. Arthur looked toward Dana. You wrote this? Yes. Did you review his remote activity? I reviewed his participation in leadership activities. That wasn't my question. Dana's voice tightened. Senior roles require presence. Arthur pointed toward the screen. He was present. Just not in this building. Dana said nothing. Thomas Harrison sat quietly at the far end of the table. This was no longer his meeting, but he did not leave. Melissa opened another section. There's also the termination documentation. Arthur's expression changed. What about it? The reason entered this afternoon is failure to follow management direction combined with an established pattern of availability concerns. Dana nodded. That's accurate. Melissa turned another page. But the management direction involved signing an incident report. Yes. And the system audit contradicts the report he refused to sign. The room became silent. Dana leaned forward. The report was not intended as a technical reconstruction. It named an employee as responsible. Dana's voice sharpened. Melissa, if every operational document becomes an investigation, Marcus Reed's voice suddenly came from the conference room speaker. Melissa had patched him in from the warehouse. Maybe it should when my name's on it. Dana stared at the phone. Marcus continued. I didn't change that load. Melissa said, We've confirmed that, Marcus. Then why was Caleb asked to sign something saying I did? No one answered immediately. Marcus gave a tired laugh. Thought so. Arthur leaned closer to the speaker. Marcus, did Caleb discuss the report with you before his termination? He told me the system showed I wasn't responsible. Anything else? No. You knew he was refusing to sign? Not until after he was gone. Arthur nodded. Thank you. Marcus did not hang up. Instead he said, One more thing. Arthur waited. If you're deciding whether Caleb was available enough, you might want to check who answers the emergency queue after dinner. The call ended. Dana looked down at the table. For the first time that day, she did not have an explanation ready. The meeting ended without the Harrison agreement being signed. Thomas gathered his papers. Arthur stood. Thomas, I apologize for the disruption. Thomas put the folder into his briefcase. I'm not offended. Arthur looked relieved. Then Thomas added, I'm concerned. Arthur's expression tightened. Thomas continued. If your internal review shows this was a misunderstanding, call me. And if it doesn't? Thomas looked toward the empty chair where Dana had been sitting before HR asked her to remain behind. Then I need to know what kind of company I'm expanding with. He closed the briefcase. And Arthur? Yes. Don't bring Caleb back because I asked for him. Arthur frowned. Thomas walked toward the door. Bring him back only if you can explain why he should trust you. That night, Caleb checked his bank account after Ruby went to bed. He wrote down 3 numbers on a yellow notepad. Mortgage, utilities, groceries. Then he added another line. Health insurance. He stared at it. For the first time that day, the practical fear arrived fully. No conference room, no Dana, no Thomas Harrison, Just numbers. Caleb rubbed both hands over his face. On the counter sat Ruby's lunchbox, ready for the morning. He looked at it for several seconds, then at the framed photograph of Anna near the refrigerator. "Could use an opinion," he whispered. The photograph offered none. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Caleb considered ignoring it, then answered. Caleb Morgan. "Mr. Morgan, this is Melissa Grant from Whitmore Human Resources." Caleb sat straighter. "Hello, I'm calling regarding today's termination." He waited. "We are formally placing that decision under review." Caleb looked at the yellow notepad. "What does that mean for me?" "It means we are examining the documentation and circumstances surrounding the decision." "Am I still terminated?" A pause. "For tonight, yes." Caleb appreciated the direct answer. Melissa continued. "I also need to ask whether you would be willing to speak with us tomorrow morning." Caleb looked toward Ruby's bedroom. "What time?" 8:30? "I drop my daughter at school at 8:10. "We can make it 9. That detail surprised him more than it should have. "All right. Mr. Morgan?" "Yes? I've reviewed the incident file from this afternoon." Caleb said nothing. "The audit trail was there." "I know. You added it before leaving." "Yes." Another pause. "Why?" Caleb frowned. "Why what?" "Why preserve the company record after you knew you were being dismissed?" He looked at Anna's photograph, then at the numbers on the pad. "Because Marcus still had to work there tomorrow." Melissa did not answer for a moment. When she finally did, her voice had changed. "Thank you. We'll speak in the morning." The call ended. Caleb sat alone in the kitchen. For the first time since setting his badge on that conference table, something shifted. Not relief. He still had no job, no guarantee, no idea what tomorrow would bring. But the truth had survived the room where Dana tried to bury it, and now someone else had found it. Caleb closed the banking app. At 9:41 p.m., across town, Melissa Grant sent Arthur Bell a confidential summary of her preliminary review. The last sentence was only 14 words long, but it changed the question the company was asking. Not, should Caleb Morgan be rehired? The question was now, how did an employee with this record become the person management decided to remove? And Dana Whitmore was about to have to answer it. At 8:07 the next morning, Caleb stood outside Ruby's school with one hand wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. Ruby adjusted the strap of her backpack. "You have the meeting today?" "At 9. Are they giving your job back?" "I don't know." She narrowed her eyes. "Are you going to make them apologize?" Caleb smiled. "You're very invested in this apology. They fired you for telling the truth." "That's a simplified version. It's the correct version." Caleb laughed under his breath. Again, embarrassingly simple. Ruby stepped toward the school entrance, then turned back. "Dad?" "Yeah? If they say you can come back, you don't have to say yes just because you're scared." The smile disappeared from his face. For a moment, Caleb wondered how much he had failed to hide the night before. "Go to school. I'm serious." "I know." Ruby waved and disappeared through the doors. Caleb stayed where he was for another few seconds. Then he looked at his phone. 8:09. For years, nearly every decision he made had been shaped by the need to keep life stable for Ruby. Take the reliable job. Keep the benefits. Avoid unnecessary risk. Make the mortgage payment. Never let her feel how thin the margin sometimes became. But stability, he was beginning to understand, was not the same thing as accepting anything simply because losing it was frightening. At 8:12, Caleb got into his car and drove toward the company that had fired him less than 16 hours earlier. He did not enter through the employee doors. His badge no longer worked. Melissa Grant met him in the lobby. "Thank you for coming." Caleb nodded. She offered him a visitor badge. For a second, neither of them missed the irony. Caleb clipped it to his coat. "Different color," he said. Melissa almost smiled. Conference room B, not C. Caleb noticed that too. Inside were Melissa and Arthur Bell. Dana was not there. Arthur stood when Caleb entered. "Mr. Morgan, Caleb is fine." Arthur gestured toward a chair. Caleb sat. His hands remained in his lap. Arthur began. "First, I want to apologize for the way your termination was handled." Caleb listened. "We completed a preliminary review last night and continued it this morning. There are significant concerns regarding both the documentation used in your dismissal and the management process leading to it." Caleb glanced at Melissa. "Significant enough that I'm not fired anymore?" Arthur paused. Melissa answered instead. "The termination has been rescinded." Caleb absorbed the words. He had imagined hearing them several times during the drive. They felt less dramatic in real life, perhaps because he now knew that having the word removed from a document did not remove the previous afternoon from his memory. Arthur continued, "You will receive back pay for the interruption." Caleb nodded slowly. "And Dana?" Arthur exchanged a glance with Melissa. Melissa spoke. "Dana has been placed on administrative leave while the review is completed." Caleb did not celebrate. He simply asked, "Is Marcus's record corrected?" Melissa nodded. "The incident report has been amended. No performance action will be taken against him." Caleb exhaled. It was the first answer that actually relieved him. "Good," Arthur noticed. "You asked about Marcus before you asked about yourself." Caleb looked at him. "Marcus didn't do anything." Arthur sat back. "No, he didn't." A silence followed. Then Arthur opened a folder. "There's more you should know." The internal review had gone farther than Caleb expected. Melissa had compared Dana's written evaluations against objective activity reports for the previous year. The pattern was consistent. Employees who regularly stayed late in the office received stronger comments about commitment, leadership visibility, executive readiness. Employees who used flexible schedules or worked remotely were more frequently described as difficult to access, less engaged, limited in advancement readiness. Caleb's record was the clearest example. He had completed more work than several employees rated above him. He had higher client retention, fewer unresolved cases, more after-hours emergency responses. Yet Dana's evaluations repeatedly returned to the same phrase, limited availability. Arthur turned a page. "There's a note here from your last promotion discussion." Caleb recognized it immediately. He had applied for a team lead role 10 months earlier. Another employee got it. He had been told the decision came down to leadership experience. Arthur read, "Caleb is reliable within scheduled hours, but family obligations continue to limit broader availability." He looked up. "Were you ever shown this?" "No." "Were you ever told your family situation was part of the decision?" "No." Melissa added carefully, "We are not making legal conclusions in this meeting. We're reviewing management judgment and compliance with our internal standards." Caleb nodded. He understood the distinction. Arthur continued. "Dana also excluded 2 customer commendations from the promotion packet." Caleb frowned. "Which customers?" Melissa pushed a page across the table. He saw the first name, Harrison Home Supply, then another, a regional appliance retailer Caleb had helped during a billing dispute the previous winter. Caleb stared at the sheet. "She had these?" "Yes." "Why weren't they included?" "We asked her that this morning." Caleb waited. Arthur answered. "She said they did not address leadership availability." Caleb leaned back. For the first time, anger surfaced, quietly. Not because Dana had disliked him, not even because she had fired him, because the decision had started long before yesterday. Every evening he had rushed through traffic to pick up Ruby. Every late-night login. Every problem he solved from the kitchen table. Dana had not simply failed to notice those things. She had decided they did not count. Caleb looked at Arthur. "So I was measured against a rule nobody told me existed." Arthur did not defend it. Yes, that answer mattered. Not because it fixed anything, because someone finally said it plainly. A knock sounded at the door. Melissa opened it. Thomas Harrison entered. Caleb immediately stood. Mr. Harrison, Thomas smiled. There he is. Caleb shook his hand. I heard you caused some trouble yesterday. Thomas raised an eyebrow. I was going to accuse you of the same thing. For the first time that morning, the tension in Caleb's shoulders loosened. Thomas sat beside him. Arthur said, Thomas asked to speak with you before he leaves. Caleb looked at him. Thomas rested both hands on the table. I owe you an explanation. You don't owe me anything. That's where you're wrong. Thomas reached into his folder and removed a printed email. After the Dayton shipment incident, I sent this to Whitmore. Caleb remembered the call. He did not remember an email. Thomas continued. I wrote that your handling of the situation was the reason we decided to renew our distribution agreement. Caleb blinked. You never told me that. You told me not to make a fuss. That sounds like me. It was annoying. Caleb smiled. Thomas slid the email over. At the bottom was one sentence Caleb had never seen. If our relationship ever expands, I would want Caleb Morgan involved in the account. Caleb read it. Thomas said, when our ownership group approved the expansion, I repeated that request. Arthur looked uncomfortable. Thomas continued, your leadership team knew I wanted you in yesterday's meeting. Caleb looked at Arthur. Arthur nodded. The request reached sales. It did not reach Dana before your termination. Another broken connection. Another small administrative failure. But this one had consequences. Thomas leaned closer. Now here's the part I need you to understand. Caleb waited. I didn't request you because you saved one shipment. Caleb frowned. Thomas pointed to the email. I requested you because of the first phone call. The one where you yelled at me? Thomas smiled. The one where you could have blamed the carrier. Caleb said nothing. I've owned stores for 35 years, Thomas continued. People become very creative when mistakes cost money. His voice softened. You weren't. Caleb looked down at the paper. Thomas added, that kind of person is harder to replace than somebody who knows a spreadsheet. The room went quiet. Caleb did not know why that sentence affected him more than being told his termination had been rescinded. Maybe because it had nothing to do with staying late, or titles, or quarterly metrics. Thomas had noticed the one thing Caleb never knew how to put on a performance review. He had tried to be someone Ruby would still respect if she heard every conversation he had at work. Apparently, someone else had noticed too. Thomas left shortly afterward. Arthur closed the folder. There is one more matter. Caleb almost laughed. There usually is. Arthur nodded. I'm not going to pretend yesterday didn't happen. Good. And I'm not going to ask you to return to exactly the same position under exactly the same structure. Caleb's expression changed. Arthur continued. The Harrison expansion needs a senior client operations lead. We had intended to recruit externally. Caleb said nothing. We would like to offer you the role. There it was. But no applause. No room full of executives. No miraculous salary figure. Just 3 people around a table and an offer Caleb had not expected. Arthur explained the role. A small team. Greater authority over account recovery. A salary increase. 2 required office days each week. The remainder flexible around client needs and completed work. Caleb listened until Arthur finished. Then he asked, why? Arthur looked surprised. You're qualified. That's not what I mean. Caleb placed both hands on the table. Why are you offering it to me? Arthur glanced at Melissa. Because the review showed your performance warranted greater responsibility. And because Thomas Harrison wants me? Arthur did not lie. That is a factor. Caleb nodded. Then I need to ask something. Go ahead. If Harrison had never asked for me yesterday, would anyone in this building have looked at my record? Neither Arthur nor Melissa answered immediately. That silence gave Caleb his answer. He continued. If I come back, am I coming back because losing the Harrison agreement scared the company? Arthur opened his mouth. Caleb finished before he could speak. Or because what happened was wrong. Arthur sat very still. Melissa looked at Caleb with something close to respect. Finally, Arthur said, Both things forced us to look. Caleb appreciated that answer. Arthur continued. But what we found was wrong whether Thomas Harrison had been here or not. Caleb looked toward the visitor badge clipped to his coat. Then at the offer. Arthur pushed the folder across the table. You don't need to answer today. Caleb looked up. No? No. Arthur stood. Take it home. Home. The words settled differently now. Caleb picked up the folder. I'll think about it. As he reached the door, Melissa called his name. Caleb. He turned. The review into Dana's conduct is continuing, but she will not return to a supervisory role here. Caleb absorbed that. He had imagined he might feel satisfaction. Instead, he thought about how much easier yesterday would have been if Dana had simply checked the audit trail. I didn't want her job, he said. Melissa nodded. I know. I didn't even want her fired. I know that too. Caleb looked at the folder in his hand. I just wanted Marcus's name off something that wasn't true. Melissa gave a small nod. That's why we're having this conversation. Caleb left. At 3:06 that afternoon, he sat alone in his car outside Ruby's school. The new job offer lay unopened on the passenger seat. He had read it twice already. He knew the salary. He knew the schedule. He knew the title. What he did not yet know was whether returning to Whitmore would teach Ruby the right lesson. That you stand up for yourself? Or that people can hurt you badly enough, apologize correctly, and still expect everything to return to normal. At 3:09, Ruby appeared through the school doors. She opened the passenger door and saw the folder. What's that? Caleb looked at her. A job offer. Her eyes widened. From them? Yes. Did they say sorry? Caleb smiled. They did. Ruby climbed in. So, are you going back? Caleb started the engine. I haven't decided. Ruby buckled her seatbelt. Then she said something that would decide more than she realized. You should only go back if they know why you leave. Caleb looked over. Why I leave? At 5. She shrugged. For me. Caleb stared through the windshield. All at once, the question became much simpler. He did not need Whitmore to forgive him for being a father. He needed to know they no longer believed there was anything to forgive. And before he accepted their offer, he intended to find out. Caleb did not call Whitmore Distribution that evening. He made dinner. He checked Ruby's homework. He washed 2 plates while she practiced 3 lines from the school play badly enough to make him laugh. Only after she went upstairs did he open the offer again. The salary mattered. He would be lying to himself if he pretended otherwise. So did the health insurance. So did knowing the mortgage would be paid next month without touching the savings account he had spent years building. But Caleb kept returning to one paragraph. Schedule expectations will be determined according to client requirements and operational needs. It sounded reasonable. It also sounded familiar. At 8:46 the next morning, Caleb called Melissa Grant. I have one question before I answer. Go ahead. What happens the next time someone decides leadership means sitting in the building until 7? Melissa was quiet. Caleb continued. I don't want a special exception because I'm a single father. That isn't what we're offering. Then put that in writing. Another pause. What exactly do you want in writing? Caleb looked toward the stairs. Ruby would be coming down any minute. That performance is measured by the work, not by whose car is still in the parking lot after dinner. Melissa did not answer immediately. Then she said, I think Arthur needs to hear that. The second meeting was shorter than the first. Caleb did not negotiate a dramatic title. He did not ask for an executive office. He asked for clarity. If the Harrison account needed him at night, he would work at night. If a customer had an emergency, he would answer. If a deadline required extra hours, he would do what the job required. But on ordinary days, he would leave in time to pick up Ruby. No whispered apologies. No unofficial penalty hidden inside future reviews. No assumption that being physically visible meant being more committed. Arthur Bell listened. Then Caleb added one more condition. And it can't just apply to me. Arthur frowned. What do you mean? If I'm the only person who gets flexibility because Thomas Harrison knows my name, then you haven't fixed anything. Melissa looked toward Arthur. Caleb continued. Marcus shouldn't need a client to defend him. Natalie shouldn't need an executive watching before her work counts. Whatever standard you use for me should be the standard for everyone. Arthur sat back. Caleb expected resistance. Instead, the company president slowly nodded. We started reviewing that yesterday. He slid a one-page document across the table. Whitmore was revising its regional performance guidelines. Managers would be required to evaluate completed work, client outcomes, documented responsiveness, and team responsibilities separately from physical office presence. Flexible work arrangements would be written rather than informally granted, and termination decisions involving documented performance concerns would require a second-level review. Caleb read the page. This existed yesterday? No, Arthur said. Then don't tell people I changed the company. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Caleb folded the paper. Tell them yesterday showed you where it was already failing. Arthur smiled slightly. That sounds less flattering. It's probably more useful. For the first time in 2 days, the three of them laughed. Then Caleb signed the offer. Dana Whitmore never returned to the regional office. The full internal review confirmed that Caleb's termination had relied heavily on a pattern Dana herself had created, treating physical presence after hours as evidence of commitment while minimizing remote work and customer results that contradicted her conclusions. The Marcus Reed incident made the problem worse. Dana had known the audit trail did not support blaming him, yet she had still pushed to finalize the report before the Harrison review. Whitmore ended her employment the following week. Caleb heard about it from Melissa. He did not ask for details. He did not celebrate. When Marcus called and said, "Guess you won," Caleb corrected him. "No." Marcus laughed. "You got your job back." "She lost hers. Sounds like winning." Caleb looked through his kitchen window. Ruby was in the backyard trying to teach their elderly dog to jump over a broomstick. "I wasn't trying to beat Dana. What were you trying to do?" "Make sure your name didn't stay on a lie." Marcus went quiet. Then he said, "Well, you did that too." That was enough for Caleb. 3 weeks later, the expanded Harrison agreement was signed. Thomas Harrison insisted on shaking Caleb's hand afterward. "I hear they gave you a promotion." "They gave me more meetings." Thomas laughed. "That's usually what promotion means." Caleb smiled. Then Thomas lowered his voice. "You know, I didn't expect all this when I asked where you were." "Neither did I." Thomas held out his hand again. "For what it's worth, I'm glad I asked." Caleb shook it. "So am I." But the moment Caleb remembered most from that month did not happen in a boardroom. It happened on an ordinary Thursday. At 4:57 p.m., Caleb was finishing an email when Natalie stopped beside his desk. "You heading out?" For just a second, the old instinct returned. Explain. Justify. Tell her he would log back in later. Mention that the day's work was finished. Prove he had earned the right to leave. Then Caleb looked at the clock. 4:58. Ruby's waiting. Natalie nodded toward the elevators. Then don't keep her waiting. That was all. No judgment. No sigh. No reminder about leadership. Caleb closed his laptop. He picked up his keys. And at 5 o'clock, he walked out. At 5:14, Ruby was standing outside the school when his car pulled into the pickup lane. She climbed inside and dropped her backpack at her feet. "You're early. 1 minute. That counts." Caleb smiled. Ruby looked at the new badge clipped to his jacket. Different title. Same company. Then she looked at him. "So they finally understand?" Caleb knew what she meant. He pulled away from the curb. "I think they're learning." Ruby nodded as if this were acceptable. A few seconds later, she started telling him about rehearsal. Caleb listened. Traffic moved slowly through the intersection ahead. His phone buzzed once in the cup holder. A work email. Caleb glanced at the screen. Nothing urgent. He turned it face down. Ruby kept talking. For years, Caleb had left work at 5 with the strange feeling that he was abandoning something important. It had taken losing his job for him to understand the truth. He had never been leaving his responsibilities behind. He had simply been going to the responsibility that mattered first. And this time, he did not apologize for it.